protect our rights at the same time that we're protecting our safety.
A cautious response this morning from the official opposition to the Harper government's new anti-terrorism legislation. The bill would give Canada's spy agency more power to stop a suspected extremist's travel plans. It would also give government officials more power to disrupt bank transactions and secretly interfere with radical websites. Both the New Democrats and Liberals say they want to take a closer look before deciding whether to back the measures. Privacy advocates have also weighed in, expressing concerns over civil rights. So for more on this, let's turn to security expert Ray Boisvert. He is a former assistant director of intelligence for C-SIS, and he joins us now live from Toronto. Good morning, Ray. What is your impression of this bill? I mean, we're hearing knee-jerk reaction or necessary measure.
Well, it's a tough call. There's no doubt. You can tell by the caution of all parties involved, from the Prime Minister's words, trying to balance out both the security piece and that very delicate balance about protecting rights. Both opposition party leaders have also been very cautious, but I'm certainly not denouncing it forthwith. I think ultimately, this is a seismic shift. I joined C-SIS in 1984 when it was first created. It was very much, in those days, a counterintelligence organization about espionage cases. Fast forward 3 decades later, and we're in a very different environment. The kind of casework I used to do in those early days was slow. Sometimes it lasted 4 years around a suspected intelligence officer. Now we're talking about from the flash to the moment of the boom, we're talking sometimes weeks, days, and occasionally hours. So it was time for a shift. It's a question of now, do we get the right shift, and is that enough? Certainly the question of resources remains wide open.
And from my understanding, C-SIS has been allowed to collect and analyze information, so there's investigation there. But now it sounds like action, being able to disrupt things. What does that say to you?
Well, I think it speaks really well to a recognition that the environment has shifted, changed tremendously. Part of the problem when I was the Director General of the principal Counter-terrorism program is that, and this is 3 to 4 years ago, we were overwhelmed by the number of cases. I can't even imagine the way it is now. Most of those cases represent very different sort of profiles. A lot of them show commitment to harming others or doing something very violent. But there's always this constant guessing game whether or not they're truly serious or have the capability. So the cup spilleth over. And there's a lot of things that can be done early on in the timeline. It's similar to a cancer diagnosis. Get at things early and you have a far better prognosis. So we're talking about threat diminishment activities. And they're very, I think in some ways, to be very low level. And they speak to key things: money, prophesizing or radicalizing, and travel abroad to go commit murder or mayhem somewhere else. So these things are critical. And I think there's a very strong judicial review process because everything has to be authorized by a court. So that gives me some comfort. And CERC, the review committee, has been specifically tasked to review those activities every year.
Yeah, but you have to also wonder about resources, right? When we're talking about all these different avenues that a potential terrorist could take, and then to be under surveillance with that, and then to be investigated, to be followed, does C-SIS have the resources?
I don't think they have enough resources to give me the comfort level that I would like to see. I get the same from other Western jurisdictions as well. It's the same everywhere. Other leaders I've spoken to in the last year have all said the same. There are far too many emerging targets who show a predisposition to the message of radicalization and a will to do harm. And as we saw with the case in Saint-Jean and the case in Ottawa, to be able to properly surveil somebody, properly investigate, it takes tons of resources. The commissioner of the RCMP, Bob Paulson, has said himself he's had to make tough choices over lesser important investigations. So I think ultimately my final concern is that we need to focus on terrorism. Public safety is the #1 priority for a government, but there's a whole bunch of other things that are going on. I suspect they're not getting the attention. Espionage cases, foreign interference cases where other governments interfere in communities in Canada, and I suspect those aren't getting the attention they deserve. And I think national security is a big holistic issue. It's not just terrorism. So I fear for that.
Yeah, and then there's civil liberties, right? During a Q&A on Friday, the Prime Minister was asked about what kind of risks the new legislation could pose to people's civil liberties, Ray. We want to play a little part of his response for you.
Sure.
This is really what we get from our opposition, that every time we talk about security, they suggest that somehow our freedoms are threatened. We do not buy the argument that every time you protect Canadians, you somehow take away their liberties. It is a jihadi terrorist who endanger our security who would take away our freedoms.
So what do you make of that, Ray? Would C-SIS have to define someone as a jihadi terrorist before the courts, before they could, cancel one of their flights?
Well, they certainly have to demonstrate sort of reasonable suspicion and cause to want to intercede in some way. So the threshold will be defined through common law and through different interpretations by the courts. The courts in Canada are still one of the most respected institutions for Canadians, and I think they've done a very good job in putting the charter first over the years. I think a number of cases I've been involved in are ones I follow elsewhere in criminal law. So I think that I rest well with that concept. I think the Prime Minister is quite correct in the sense that we always have to look at one wins, the other loses if we get the chemistry right, if we get the formula well in place. And of course, it'll take some challenges on that. I do very much respect those voices out there from the privacy community elsewhere saying, hey, let's look at this. Let's take a serious look, and as we should. And I think that's why the legislative process is important. We need to open that up, deconstruct it a little bit, and see whether or not it is the appropriate mix. Because at the end of the day, it's a delicate balance. But right now, from what I see, I'm relatively quite positive, and I think it'll make a difference.
Okay, great to get your insights, Ray. Thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure.
That is Ray Boisvert, former Assistant Director of Intelligence for C-SIS.